and I'm president of the Asian Pacific American Librarians Association. I'd like to welcome you to our webinar, Microaggressions and the Asian Pacific Islander Community, featuring Alana Iko-Moore and Jana Alabi. For those of you who are not APALA members and wondering what APALA might be, APALA is a professional library organization dedicated to cultivating Asian Pacific American leadership through mentorship and professional engagement, advancing social justice, and providing opportunities for dialogue and networking to promote the needs of APA professionals and those who serve APA communities. APALA is an affiliate of the American Library Association and maintains a separate membership base, which basically means you don't have to be an ALA member to be an APALA member. For more information about APALA and to become a member, please visit our website at www.apalaweb.org. Thanks to our partners like ALA, CERT, and immigrants, we can also offer great programs like our APALA Presidents Program at ALA Annual in Chicago, featuring Deepa Iyer, who will be giving a talk entitled Rising Up, South Asian, Muslim, Arab, and Sikh Communities Reshape America on Saturday about the implications of the domestic war on terror and the power of storytelling as a means of resistance and solidarity. On Sunday, Deepa will be holding a workshop for us entitled Solidarity in Action, Combating Xenophobia and Islamophobia, where she will discuss the targeting of South Asian, Arab, Muslim, and Sikh Americans and the tools we can use to dismantle Islamophobia and xenophobia while supporting the communities we serve. We are so thankful for the opportunity to hear her speak and hope that you all can join us. With that said, I'm sure you're eager to get this webinar started. If you have any audio issues, please feel free to IM us in the chat box as the affiliate host or Gwendolyn Prelitz, and we'll troubleshoot the best we can. I now turn over the controls to our wonderful speakers, Alana Iko-Moore and Jana Alabi, who will tell us all about microaggressions and the API community.
Hi, everybody, and welcome. This is Alana Iko-Moore. I just wanted to thank Lessa so much for inviting us to present this webinar and for all of you for joining us today. We're going to be covering a lot of material, so we'll be keeping the pace up, but you should also feel free to interact with each other in the chat box, ask questions, all of that good stuff. So as you can see, I'm at the University of California, San Diego. I'm a 2003 Spectrum Scholar and also an ARL Leadership and Career Development Program Fellow. I'm very grateful to these programs, which help to recruit and retain people of color in the field through financial stipends, leadership development, and cohort building. I'm also a longtime APALA member, past executive board member, and I've also served on the steering committee of the Joint Conference of Librarians of Color, where I managed all aspects of the program. This is also where I was first introduced to Jana's work on microaggressions, as it was one of the first research studies on the topic that focused specifically on the library and information science profession. I identify as a queer, cisgender woman of color, and when I drill down more specifically, I claim Japanese American, white, and Native American heritage, and other times I just go by the label mixed race or multiracial, and my preferred gender pronouns are she, her, and hers.
And I'm Jana Alabi. I'm a reference librarian at Auburn University Libraries, where I'm the liaison for English, Psychology, and Africana Studies. And as Alana mentioned, I first met her at JCLC, where I was giving a poster with some kind of preliminary research results. And my interest in racial microaggressions really kind of goes back to my undergrad days as an English major and really being drawn to African American lit and using that as sort of a lens to kind of see the world through race and racism. So when I came into libraries, I kind of brought that idea, that lens with me. And so I'm realize that I'm constantly trying to find an answer to what is my role as a white librarian in a predominantly white profession in terms of promoting, valuing diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice. And as I said, I'm white, I identify as straight, cisgender woman. My preferred pronouns are she, her, and hers. And so just a word about the environment that we would like to create here. As Alana has already mentioned, please do use the chat box, interact with each other. We do ask that you really try to keep in mind that your discussions, your conversations with each other, with us, should be informed, respectful, thoughtful, and engaged. So we do want this to be a learning environment. Also, as Alana mentioned, we'll try to answer your questions kind of as we go along. If you have sort of a really deep question, we might have to hold that until the Q&A. Also, I should say that neither Alana nor I claim to be experts on microaggressions or diversity. We've done some reading, we've done some research, we've had some experiences, and we would like to share those with you, but at least I personally am uncomfortable with this idea of expert. And we want you guys to know kind of what to expect. So if you have attended our webinar for Emerging Leaders or LLAMA, there'll be some similar content, but we've actually added a lot that is really specific to the Asian and Pacific Islander community. But this is still a basic kind of introduction. So if we were going to put a course number on this, it would be 101. So if you're expecting graduate level or 404 type course, feel free to get in touch with either Alana or myself later. And I'm sure that we would love to continue those conversations. One thing I think that I would also like to mention right now is that as we go through and we're talking about racial and LGBT microaggressions, personally the research that I have done has been focused within the profession, so how libraries and library folk interact with each other. But I think it's important to sort of think about a call from Rachel Lockman that was in CNRL News in an article on academic libraries and social justice. And so she says that, our views of microaggressions may begin with our interactions with patrons or with colleagues, but we really should expand that to encompass our patrons as well. So we, as library workers and our patrons, are both united through the microaggressions that we experience in our daily lives. And as librarians, we can use that position of privilege to be allies instead of perpetrators. So I think that we would like for you to kind of keep that in mind as we go along. So it's not just about how do we treat each other, how do we treat staff and librarians, but also how do we treat our patrons and how do we interact with them.
Okay, so who is an Asian Pacific Islander? We toss that term around a lot. We sometimes are told that we have so much in common, we all look the same, but really we're a varied group of folk. We can trace our roots back to dozens of countries in the Far East, Southeast Asia, Indian subcontinent, and each country of origin subgroup has its own unique history, culture, language, religious beliefs, economic and demographic traits, social and political values, and also many pathways into the United States. So we'll be talking broadly about the Asian Pacific Islander community. We'll be using the acronym API, and I want to acknowledge that API might not be your preferred term or the term for everyone, but it's what we'll be using today. It's also important to note that the terms Asia or even Asian Pacific mean different things to different people and include different countries of origin. In some cases, Russia and the Middle East are included. In other cases, they're not. And there's a million maps out there, and they all say that the Asian Pacific area is slightly different. And of course, when we talk about the Asian Pacific Islander, a lot of times we do forget about the Pacific Islanders. And where are they? So when you look at the previous maps, the Pacific Islands weren't on there, even though one of those maps was labeled online as an Asian Pacific Island area map. So you can also see that Pacific Islanders varied in background, geographic area, experience, and origin, and they often feel invisible within the API community. There's also other voices and faces that feel invisible within the API community because most of the voices and faces that are usually seen and heard in our mainstream society belong to East Asian folk or non-brown Asians. Our API community also includes many folks with mixed race or multiracial backgrounds, as well as many adoptees. So with these shared and divergent experiences, and as we've grown in diversity over the decades, with so many different subgroups, with our own rich political, cultural, economic, and religious histories, it's more important than ever, especially in this political climate, to function as one community whenever possible, to support each other and to work to build a very strong movement. So are you an Asian American? Are you an Asian Pacific Islander? According to a recent Pew Research Center study, actually not that recent, the data is about 5 years old, but it was some of the most recent data I could find. 19% of folks interviewed said they describe themselves as Asian American, but the majority of folks interviewed said they most often describe themselves by their country of origin. So for example, Chinese American, Vietnamese American, Vietnamese, which is actually very similar to the Latinx population in our country as well.
And so let's start off actually just with some examples of microaggressions and then kind of define this phenomenon, and then we'll kind of delve a little bit more into racial microaggressions and then LGBT. So we would actually like to hear from you. These are some examples. So we'd like for you to think about, have you heard these statements, maybe where you might have heard them? And please let us know in the chat box if you feel like you've heard them. Maybe let us know where. It doesn't have to be a detailed example, but just home, workplace, something like that. So a lot of these too, the tone of voice, the body language can also send its own kind of message here. So when I look at you, I don't see color. That's so gay. But you don't look like a lesbian, which is oftentimes, I think, with a face of shock and awe, right? Where are you from? And if you say Atlanta, Georgia, someone's like, oh no, I mean, like, where were you born? So these are things that we oftentimes do here kind of in our society, sometimes in the workplace, sometimes in our home. And it does sound like some of you are also experiencing a lot of these, yes, or you've heard them. And personally, I kind of like to think that libraries are sort of, I don't know, especially because I work in an academic library, I think that they can be kind of these bastions of liberality and just maybe a little bit better about this, better about not having as many microaggressions or biases or not intentionally discriminating. But that's not always the case. So we did want to mention the LIF Microaggressions Tumblr, which is it's a page, it's a project. They also have a zine created by 6 awesome women of color, including several, I think 4 API and APALA members. So Cynthia Orozco, Annie Fo, Simone Fujita, Rose Chu, as well as 2 Latinx members, Erica Montenegro, Elvia Arroyo Ramirez. And so they collect examples of microaggressions that people want to share that they have experienced in library information science. So this is also happening within our library spaces as well. And if you would like to visit the site, I encourage you to do that. Maybe not if you're already feeling kind of down. But just to sort of have a formal definition of microaggressions, Lana and I are going to use Kevin Nadal's definition because it's fairly expansive. So they are brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, and environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, negative slights and insults toward members of oppressed groups. So some aspects of this definition that are incredibly important are, so they're derogatory messages, they're not happy messages, they're not reaffirming messages, they're delivered to members of marginalized groups, And it doesn't matter whether the intent was to give someone a compliment or not. It's really about what message was received, and that they are every day. These are happening repeatedly again and again and again. So you can sort of see how it might be a death by 1,000 cuts or 1,000 paper cuts. Also, something that's important is that some of the research on people who experience racism and discrimination suggests that this sort of subtle form of discrimination and expressions of bias are not only sort of just as, but in some cases they can be even more harmful than more overt expressions. And so that's something that we can keep in mind when we're looking at these. And so researchers have, in an attempt to try and pin down microaggressions, they've come up with these 3 categories or 3 forms, and they really cover a lot of ground. So micro-assaults, which are really, they can be more akin to old-fashioned racism, and they're going to be pretty overt, pretty explicit. So name-calling, for example. So oftentimes there's not a lot of kind of guessing left, like you know what occurred here. Micro-insults, however, are going to be much more subtle. Oftentimes those are delivered unconsciously, and so they're going to convey insensitivity and rudeness. They're going to demean someone's heritage or identity. So that might be a backhanded compliment or a subtle insult, some sort of snub, like avoiding eye contact with someone, avoiding interacting with someone from a certain group. And then micro-invalidations are also often delivered unconsciously. They can also be quite subtle, and these are messages that are really denying the experiences of marginalized groups. So, for instance, saying that racism isn't a thing that people encounter anymore, or because some states have same-sex marriage or allow same-sex marriage, like it's not an issue anymore. We don't have any more sort of homophobia or heterosexism in society. Those would be kind of invalidations. And if we look more specifically at the racial microaggressions, so it says a brief history. There are a number of people here, but I thought that they were kind of important for mentioning for various reasons. So even though we're getting a lot of attention, this term microaggressions is getting a lot of attention right now, especially in social media, and it has been for a few years. The term actually goes back to 1969, 1970 with Chester Pierce. And he is a psychiatry and education professor at Harvard. And so what's interesting about his work is that he's talking about how in psychiatry there's this emphasis on defensive mechanisms. And those are the mechanisms that reduce guilt and shame, and they basically sort of let you live without sort of overwhelming, crippling anxiety. But he's saying we need to not look at the defensive mechanisms, we also need to look at these offensive mechanisms. And so those are the ways that people assert sort of racial superiority over others. And specifically, he's looking at white and black sort of dynamics. And he says that, so these offensive mechanisms are subtle and stunning. They're usually a microaggression as opposed to a gross, dramatic, obvious macroaggression such as lynching. So he's trying to get at how racism has sort of shifted. It's not okay to be so overt in your face, but we're trying to sort of soften it, but we're not really changing that underlying idea of racial superiority of one group over another. In 1989, we have Peggy Davis, who's looking at a survey that was commissioned by the National Center for State Courts. And that survey showed that minority people reported like a strong conviction that the law would work to their disadvantage. And so she's trying to explain, well, why would African Americans, I think she's specifically looking mostly at African Americans, why would they feel like the law is not set up for them or doesn't work for them, that it's biased? And she points out that a lot of the anti-discrimination laws there's an aspect of intentionality in them. And the problem with that is that the system is set up to sort of perpetuate itself. And so you don't have to think about it to reinforce that sort of like white supremacy. All of the laws are really shaped from that point of view. And so I don't have to have this intent for it to be discriminatory, and it can still have that same effect. So it's just looking at the law as microaggression. Then in 1998, we've got Daniel Solorzano, and so he's not only looking at African Americans now, but he's looking at Chicano and Chicana scholars, and he's also bringing in this idea of gender microaggressions too, which had also kind of been on kind of a separate track. Solorzano is also employing critical race theory, which is a concept that really has come out of legal studies and law studies. And a couple of the important things about that is this idea that race is not a side note or tangential to our experiences. It's central, it's not peripheral. And that they have an emphasis on counter-narrative so that you can understand, can hear the voices of people who have been marginalized. And then when we add in Gerald Wing Su and his colleagues in 2007, that's when we're really trying to get at ways of nailing down microaggressions so that we can talk about it, do something about it. And so that's where the 3 categories or forms of microaggressions came up earlier. They've also identified a number of different themes that seem pretty common for certain groups to experience. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And in 2011, we have Kevin Nadal. And what's interesting about his work is he's actually trying to create, and he does, a racial and ethnic microaggression scale. So he's trying to quantify the experiences of microaggressions that people of color have every day. Which actually then leads into Chandra Forrest Bank and Jeffrey Jensen. And so their work in looking at a sample of like 409 students on a college campus who identify as Asian, Latino, Black, and white. And out of those groups, so the Asian, Latino, and Black participants all reported kind of about the same level of microaggressions that they experienced, but it just varied in terms of what types they experienced or what themes kind of hit them based hit a certain note based on their ethnicity and race. And they actually were using Nadal's racial and ethnic microaggression scale when they were doing that study. So I think it's interesting because we oftentimes think about Asians and Asian Americans as this quote model minority, and thinking that like, oh, well, since a lot of Asian Americans seem to have made it, somehow racism is not really a thing that affects Asian American Pacific Islanders. And Forrest Bank and Jensen are saying, that's not really true. And so one of the things that I wanted to include this quote from Sue Capodilupo et al., because I think it's really important and gets to sort of the problem, why it's hard to address racial microaggressions. And it's because they're oftentimes invisible to the perpetrator, sometimes even to the recipient, but also they can usually be explained away. So I can say, oh no, I didn't mean it that way, I was thinking of this other thing. But for the person who's receiving that negative message, there's a negative effect for them, and there is always this nagging question of like, am I being too sensitive? Did that really happen? So there's a lot of mental, emotional energy expended processing this and just trying to figure out like, what really did happen here?
All right. So we're going to move on to talking about racial microaggressions and specifically how they impact Asian Pacific Islanders. So going back to our Pew Research study, which again, the data is a few years old, but still fairly current. So Asian Americans, and I have to say the Pew Research study did not seem to include Pacific Islanders, which was very distressing. And so for that, I apologize. These statistics will focus on the Asian Americans. Foreign-born and U.S.-born made up about 6% of the population. Of these, about half, or 1 in 2 Asian immigrant adults over 18 said that they believed that they spoke English very well. Asians also made up 75% of new H-1B visa holders in the U.S., with India making up 56% alone. So these stats show a snapshot of our communities, but as we all know, microaggressions are not based on statistics or on facts, but are based on perception. So what does my Asian face say to you? What does my brown face connotate to you? What religion do you think I am? And how are you judging my citizenship status based on how I present myself? As we all know, xenophobia, fear and hatred of foreigners, is on the rise in our current political climate. South Asians in particular are being targeted. Islamophobia has also increased against folks who are Muslim or who are perceived to be Muslim. And derision toward immigrants and refugees of all kinds now seems to be perfectly acceptable in the public sphere. So I love this quote from the author of The True American, where Anand states, "I think there's a further complexity, which is being other with a capital O, or needing to go back somewhere far away. But it's not the only thing expected of Asians. Asians are also expected to be geniuses, and meek, and doctors, also good at calligraphy, and they are craved by a country that wants to be enriched by immigrant entrepreneurs, and told to stay home. It's the interaction of these mixed messages that gives the Asian American experience its particularity." So the constant contradictions, the mixed messages, kind of goes hand in hand with that feeling that Jana referenced earlier, where having those nagging questions of whether things have really happened, what kind of messages am I absorbing? So when we think about racial microaggressions in the Asian Pacific Islander community, we hear things like, you are so fill in the blank for an Asian, right? You're so, as Sunny mentioned earlier, you are so articulate for an Asian. You are so pretty for an Asian. We have stereotypes like, do you know martial arts? Or people saying, hey, what's up, Bruce Lee? Do you know how to do the hula if you are of a Pacific Island descent? If you are Hawaiian, you must know how to do the hula. This is a common one. Can you figure out the tip for the waiter? All of you folk are also good at math. You don't look Asian, which some folks think is a compliment. A lot of folks who are mixed race or multiracial get that one a lot, as it's supposed to be like, you don't look Asian, you must be so stoked that, that you don't. It's not a compliment, it's actually very insulting. Are you adopted? And you speak English so well, which goes along with the comment we had before about you are so articulate. Folks can take time right now. If they have API microaggressions that they've heard or experienced, feel free to type those in as well. And we can just keep that running. So there are common themes of racial microaggressions toward Asian Pacific Islanders listed up here, and we'll go through these fairly quickly. So the alien in our own land, it implies that all API are foreign or foreign-born. It's implied that API are not real Americans. That goes along with the microaggressions that we talked about. Where are you from? Are you a citizen? Do you speak English? Is Hawaii part of the United States? The ascription of intelligence really focuses on the model minority myth, where APIs are supposed to be bright and smart. It places a burden on the individual to live up to this expectation, and it also creates tension between API and other people of color, because the flip side of this, this ascription of intelligence, is that other people of color are less intelligent. So it's a double-edged oppression, in my opinion. There's also the denial of racial reality, which endorses the model minority myth, It dismisses experiences of racism. Asian Pacific Islanders don't experience racism. Asians are the new whites. And this is despite our history of internment camps, the denial of citizenship, and lots of laws against owning land that we've had in the past. The exoticization of Asian American women, that they are subservient, available for the physical needs of white men, seen as objects or domestic servants. And Pacific Islander women are often seen as sexy and willing to serve, which kind of is based a lot on a white colonialist history. The next one looks at the invalidation of interethnic differences. All Asians look alike, or all Asians are Japanese, Chinese, or Korean. How many folks have had someone hold up a food item from an Asian market with some characters on it and say, hey, can you read this? This also denies differences between different groups, and the brown, Asians, and Pacific Islanders are often invisible. When we pathologicize cultural values and communication styles, we value, for example, Western white verbal participation over a more contemplative silence. We have what are called lunchbox moments, where food from API culture is treated as disgusting. I know folks have heard the, ew, what is that? As someone others your food. And what I find particularly disturbing about the othering of food is the rise of white liberal foodies right now who love to culturally appropriate and appreciate food from other cultures. The recent Bon Appetit magazine article on how one should properly eat Vietnamese pho, Vietnamese noodles. So that's fine, but it's not fine when people from those actual cultures consume their own food. Second-class citizenship, treated as a lesser being, and invisibility is one we're, the API community is very familiar with. Invisibility within mainstream culture, sometimes left out of discussions on race, which are seen as focusing specifically on black and white issues. So considered white sometimes, but not accepted by whites. Invisibility occurs in a lot of different ways. All right, I'm seeing some great stuff popping up in the chat box. Oh.
Oh, and we also wanted to include, those themes were identified by Stu and his colleagues, and they were looking specifically at Asian Americans. And so we have more research that is coming out that's about Asians in the US or in Canada, and specific groups, or also in Britain, and specific groups of Asians. But one of them we wanted to include was a study that looked at Asian international students at a Canadian university, but some of these are still very similar to the ones experienced by Asian Americans. They're being excluded and avoided, they're being told to go home, or not having white students want to interact with you. As Alana already mentioned, the ascription of intelligence, sort of a disregard for international values and needs, which seems to me to be kind of similar to that invalidation of interethnic differences. But these students were really talking more about how white students and even students of color who were in Canada at that time that they interacted with had a very westernized view of the world and didn't understand sort of other cultures, other values, other ways of viewing the world. These students also were oftentimes ridiculed for their accent, the way that they pronounced a word, or even their proficiency in a certain language. And also they felt that they were rendered invisible and not wanted to, that their presence was not welcome, that it was not wanted for them to be there and to be part of these communities.
Okay, we're going to move on and talk briefly, very briefly, about LGBTQ microaggressions. LGBTQ stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning. Lots of times we add an A on there for asexual. And we can be super inclusive and add lots more on there. But for now, we're just going to use the LGBTQ for the purposes of this microaggression, knowing that it does not encompass